We continue now at the top of Daf 100b in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 100b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was dealing with the case in the Mishnah where the seller says that he sold a small eved and the buyer says, no, I bought a big eved. And they had a similar case by a field. The seller says he sold the small one. The buyer says he bought the big one. And so in that case, it said that the seller should swear that it was the small one, and then the buyer will just take the small one. And the Gemara asked three questions on the Mishnah. First, the Gemara asked that in this case, it's not a case of Bava Metzia Daf, because the claim that's being made is not the same as the response. He's not admitting partially, meaning to say the buyer is saying he's owed a particular eved, the large one, and then the seller says it's a different one altogether. That's not a partial admission. That shouldn't be Bava Metzia Daf, so why is there a shvuah in that regard? And furthermore, it's a case of Heilach. He's presenting the smaller eved, he's presenting the smaller field to him immediately, and so therefore by Heilach there's a mandamer that you don't take a shvuah in that situation by Bava Metzia Daf. And finally, the other question is, Ein nishboin al ha'avodim. If we're talking about slaves over here, there are no oaths, there are no shvuas when it comes to avodim. And so those were the three questions in terms of how to understand the Mishnah. And the Gemara answered, Rav's answer was that we're not actually talking about avodim, we're just talking about the value of avodim that's being argued upon, whether he owes the value of a large eved or a small eved. And then we really do have a case of Bava Metzia Daf. We're not actually talking about avodim, so it's not a problem of swearing when it comes to avodim, and it's not a case of Heilach anymore as well. We're talking about the value. And so that was Rav's answer. Shmuel gave a different answer. Shmuel said that we're talking about the garment, the ksus of an eved gadol and an eved katan, and we're talking about the sheaves of a large field as opposed to a small field. And now the Gemara asks ksus, when you're talking about the argument over what kind of garment, so it's still the same problem. Masha tanu lo hodelo, masha hodelo lo tanu. The claim that's being made, he's not admitting to that. He's admitting to a totally different garment, and what he's admitting to is again not the claim. So still, it's not really a case of Bava Metzia Daf. Rashi says ksus masha tanu lo hodelo ve'al ksus acheres hodelo. He's admitting to him regarding a different ksus, regarding a different garment. Ve'ena meosa shatanu. That's not the one that's being claimed. Again, the buyer is claiming the larger one, the seller is saying just the smaller one, so that's the same problem. Why is that Bava Metzia Daf? Why is there a shvuah? And the Gemara continues and answers, Kedamar Rapapa, it's like Rapapa said in a different context, B'dailafi, we're talking about Dailafi, we'll see Rashi in a moment. Hachanami B'dailafi, here also we'll give the same answer. B'dailafi, again in regard to the garments, Rashi explains, B'dailafi, Shebeged Sholem Hoya, V'adayin Mechuber, you have a large garment that's all attached. It's a bunch of pieces attached to one another. Ze Omer Ksus Gedola Machardi Lach, this one says, I bought from you a large garment, meaning more of what is stitched together. V'ze Omer Ksus Katan, and the other one says back, no, I'm only selling you a small portion of this garment, and therefore he really is admitting partially from what is being claimed, and that's why you don't have that problem. That's why there is a shvuah in this situation. But the Gemara continues, Kasha leila Rav Oshia, but Rav Oshia still had a difficulty with this. Midi ksus katani, it doesn't say anything in the Mishnah about a garment. Eved katani, it talks about a slave. Elam Rav Oshia, rather Rav Oshia says as follows, Kigon shatanu eved biksuso v'sadeh ba'omer. The case over here is that the claim was, you owe me the eved, you owe me the slave with his garment, with his clothing, you owe me the field with its sheaves. Rashi explains, Eved Gadol Biksuso, a large Eved with his clothing, Vizem Modelo Be'eved Katan Uksuso, and the other one admits to a small Eved with his clothing, the Mechuyev Shvua Misham Ksus, so therefore you have an obligation of a Shvua, of an oath, because of the garment. Umishtaba Eved Begilgal, and then you use Gilgal Shvua. Once you're already taking a Shvua on the garment, there's a mode of a mixus on the garment, then we take a Shvua on the Eved as well. And the Gemara continues, if that is the case, Vakati, but still, you still haven't really answered the question. Ksos mashatanu lo hodelo, mashahodelo lo tanu. The same garment, the garment being claimed, is not the one being admitted to. The one being admitted to is not the one being claimed. And the Gemara gives the answer we just said above. Rapapa says, B'dailafi, again, we're talking about a situation where it is a large garment, and the question just is how much of that garment was purchased. And so therefore, you do have a genuine case of Bava Metzia Daf, and then through the concept of Gilgal Shvua, you can take a Shvua on the Eved as well. But the Gemara continues, Kasha le Rav Sheshes, but then this is difficult for Rav Sheshes. Zokakin asal ashminan is the chiddush over here of the Mishnah, just this concept of Zokakin, of Gilgal Shvua, that once you're taking a Shvua on Metaltal, then you can take on the Avodim, you can take on Karka as well, you can do Gilgal Shvua. Is that all we're teaching? We already know that. Tanina, we learned that in the Mishnah, Zokakin hanachasim she'en lahem achrayis, as hanachasim she'yesh lahem achrayis, lishav alei, and if you have property where there's no lien, meaning movable property, and you're taking a Shvua on that, so along with that Shvua, you can take the Shvua on property property with a lien, which essentially refers to land. And so we already know the concept of Zokik, and we know the concept of Gilgal Shvua. Rashi says, Tanina, we learned in the Mishnah B'Kiddushin, we learned that in Kiddushin, Nechasim Shein L'Machrayis, Zokinas HaNechasim Sheyesh L'Nachrayis, L'Shava Alei, and we know this concept of Gilgal Shvua, that you can have a Shvua on Metaltalin and thereby take a Shvua on Karka, and that's true over here as well. So still, that doesn't make sense that that's what the Mishnah is saying. Elamar Rav Sheshes, rather Rav Sheshes says, Hamani Rabbi Meir he, who's the author of our Mishnah, it's Rabbi Meir, the Yamar Avda Kemetaltalin Dami. Rabbi Meir happens to hold that an Eved is considered like Metaltalin, like movable objects, and therefore we are dealing over here with the Avodim, and you can take a Shvua on Avodim. And Rashi says, Rabbi Meir he Lekaman Bebraisa, this is later on in the Braisa, Hamach Lefar Bechamur, the Kamar Rabbi Meir Avda Kemetaltalin Dami. Rabbi Meir says over there that Eved is like Metaltalin, like movable objects, Vinishba, all of you could take an oath. Well, Lekaman Parach Le Asados to Katani B'Masis and Nami Nishba. Now later we're going to ask, that could be an answer for Avodim, but we also talk about fields in the Mishnah that you take an oath, and you're not supposed to take an oath on fields as well. But in any case, the Gemara still asks, Vakati, but still, even if you're going to say an Eved is Metaltalin, we're still back to one of our other questions. Mashatanu lo hodelo, mashahodelo lo tanu. What he claimed from him, he didn't admit to. What he admitted to, he didn't claim from him. How do we answer that question? And the Gemara says to that, Savar la Rev Gamliel, it could be our Mishnah holds like Rev Gamliel. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Tanu chitam v'hoda besorim, if the claim was made of wheat, and then the admission was barley, potter, so he's potter from a shvua because he's not admitting from what the claim is. But Rebbe Gamliel mechayev, but Rebbe Gamliel says chayev. So if the Mishnah is going like Rebbe Gamliel, even though the admission is not from the claim, still we would say there's a shvua. But still we had the third question, akati, but still Halach, who isn't in a problem of Halach, because he's simply presenting what he owes. He's saying here it is right in front of us, and there's a mandomer that says by Halach there is no shvua. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Rava says, Avda dekata liyade, when we're talking about the slave, we're talking about where his hand was severed. V'saden, when we're talking about the field, shechafar baboro shichnim oros, that the field was dug up with all kinds of pits and holes in the field. And Rashi explains dekata liyade, that the hand of the Eved was severed. Lahu Eved katan, meaning that Eved katan, that small Eved, demodele begave, that the seller admitted to, he can't simply present that Eved. It's not a case of Halach because the hand was severed. So now he owes the value. Therefore, if it's not a case of Halach, that's not a problem as well. And that's how we can explain the Mishnah. Again, we can say that the case is following Rebbe Gamliel that says even by Tanu Chitam V'Hoda Sa'orim, that's considered Moed of a Mixas and there's a Shvua. And we could be following Rabbi Meir that an Eved is considered Metaltalin, and we can assume that the hand was severed. And if the hand was severed again, that's not a case of Halach. But the Gemara continues, Rabbi Meir ipcha shaminale, but don't we see the exact opposite from Rabbi Meir? And Rashi explains, ipcha shaminale, Rabbi Meir damar avda kemekarkoi dami, as we'll see in a moment. Rabbi Meir seems to say that avodim are not considered like metaltalin, but rather they're considered like karka. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, gazal behema v'izkin, if a person steals an animal and it gets older, avodim v'izkin, well, let's say a person steals slaves and they age, so now what are you supposed to pay back? Mishalim kashas hagazela, so the Tanakama says you have to pay back according to what they were worth at the time of the stealing. Rabbi Meir says, ba'avodim, when it comes to slaves, Omer lo harei shel chalafanecha. He says harei shel chalafanecha, presumably because these slaves are considered to be like land. As Rashi says, harei shel chalafanecha, the kaimulan b'Bava Kama, because we've established in Bava Kama, karka ein an exelis, that land can't really be stolen. The idea technically is that land doesn't really move, so you're not really taking it. V'chol makam shi b'reshus ba'aleh omedes, so wherever it is, it's really in the possession of its owner. But if we're going to compare avodim to karka, ve'eved kemekarkoi dami ve'ein an nigzal, slaves are also considered like land, and therefore they're also not stolen. Lios nikne legazlan, it's not considered acquired by the gazlan. L'shalim domim, that now the gazlan is going to pay money according to the value it was at the time of the thievery. Hilkach kiyazkin b'reshusei demariazkin. So therefore, when they get older, when these avodim age, they're really aging in the reshus of the original owner, and that's why Rabbi Meir says by avodim harei shel chalafanecha. And the point over here is that Rabbi Meir seems to be saying that avodim are considered to be like karka, and above we just said that avodim are like metaltalin, which is why you can take a shvua when it comes to avodim. And the Gemara answers to that, holo kasha, that's not difficult, kedamachlif Rabba bar Avua, because it could be like Rabba bar Avua, because he flipped around the shitas. Vitani, the way he taught it was Rabbi Meir Omer Meshalim Kashas HaGazela, that is Rabbi Meir that says that you pay by avodim Kashas HaGazela. He's the one that holds that the avodim are considered like metaltalin. V'chachamim Omer, the Chachamim say, Omer lo, he says to him, ba'avodim harei shel chalafanecha. When it comes to slaves, he can say to him, harei shel chalafanecha. And Rashi explains, Halo kasha dika l'shanui k'da ma'achlif Rabbi Abba bar Avua. You can always switch it around, like Rabbi Abba bar Avua said, Eloha kasha mimai d'kosav Rabbi Meir v'chulu. But now we're about to ask another question from that which Rabbi Meir holds. K'diktani v'masnisin v'chein beisados v'kamri shava. The Gemara now continues, fine, we can switch it around and say that Rabbi Meir is saying avodim are considered to be like metaltalin, but still. Elamimai d'sav Rabbi Meir makshin and karka le'evid. How do you know that Rabbi Meir holds we compare land to avodim? Ma evid nishboin av karka nishboin. You seem to be suggesting that just like by an evid, because the Mishnah was not only talking about avodim, the Mishnah had the exact same case when it came to fields. And so now you're saying just like by an evid, apparently you're saying just like by an evid you can take a shvua, so too by a karka you can take a shvua. That's the only way this answer makes sense. That's what Rashi is saying over here. K'diktani b'masnisin v'chein beis sados. The same would be true by two fields, just like two avodim. V'kamar yishava, and he says that you swear. How do you know that's true? Dilma evid hu dinishboin. Maybe Rabbi Meir would only say you take a shvua on avodim. Aval akarka lo, but maybe when it comes to land, he wouldn't go that far, and there would be no shvua. So saying the Mishnah is like Rabbi Meir doesn't help at all in terms of the case that involves land. Rashi says, Dilma avdahu k'metatli dami v'nishboin olav. Maybe avodim are considered like movable objects, and you take a shvua when it comes to avodim. Aval akarka in nishboin. Maybe when it comes to land, you don't take a shvua. And the Gemara says to that, lo salka daitach. Don't think that that is true. Meaning, don't think that it is true only by avodim, but not by karka. Titania, because we learned in a braysa, hamachlif para bechamor v'yolda. If a person does a kinyan chalip and he exchanges a cow for a donkey and it gives birth, v'chein hamocher shivchasa v'yolda. Let's say a person sells a maidservant and she gives birth. Zeh omer b'rishusi. This one says that it's really in my rishus. I'm the one entitled to the offspring. V'zeh shosik, and the other party is quiet. So zacha zacha. So then the person who says that it was in his possession, he wins the case. He gets the offspring. Zeh omer eni yodeh v'zeh omer eni yodeh. If both of them say that I don't know what happened, so then yachloku. So then they divide the offspring. Zeh omer b'rishusi v'zeh omer b'rishusi. If they both claim that they're the ones that get the offspring, yeshava hamocher sheberishuso yolda. Then the seller is the one. He should take the shvua that it was in his rishus. Lefi shekala nishboin shebator nishboin v'lo mishalmin divrei Rabbi Meir. Because Rabbi Meir holds when you take a shvua, it's always the person who's not going to pay, and so therefore the seller, he will simply take a shvua, and therefore he will not give the offspring to the buyer. And the braysa continues, v'chachamim omer, and the chachamim say, ein nishboin, one does not take a shvua, lo al ho'avodim, not on slaves, v'lo al ha'karkos, and not on land. Now in this particular braysa, besides talking about exchanging the cow for the donkey, of course, it talks about a shifcha, which is a slave. And so you see clearly Rabbi Meir is saying that you do take a shvua when it comes to slaves, but then the chachamim's response is, you don't take a shvua on slaves or land. And so therefore, lav mechlal, doesn't that imply that Rabbi Meir savar nishboin, that Rabbi Meir completely disagrees with the chachamim and says that you can take a shvua on slaves and on land? And so then we see that Rabbi Meir takes this shita and applies it even to land. But the Gemara says that's not really true. Mimai, how do you know that's what Rabbi Meir would say? All we have over here is the opinion of the chachamim saying you don't take a shvua on slaves and land, and you have the opinion of Rabbi Meir that you take on slaves, but Rabbi Meir doesn't say anything about land. Dilma kashem ka amrule. Maybe they're saying kashem. They're saying just like you admit to us by land. Kihechi da odis lan bekarkos. Just like you admit to us by land that there's no shvua. Odi lan nami ba'avadim. You should admit to us also by slaves. And so therefore we have no proof. And again, we're back to our question. Using Rabbi Meir could answer our question on the Mishnah by avodim, but it doesn't answer anything by karka. And the Gemara continues, Teda, you should know that this is true, that Rabbi Meir does make a distinction between karka and avodim. Tetanan, because we learned in a Mishnah, this is a Mishnah Mesechet Shvuas, Rabbi Meir says, Yesh devorim shein kekarka ve'einon kekarka. There are things that are like land, but they're not exactly like land. Ve'ein chachamim modim lo, but the chachamim do not agree with Rabbi Meir. Ketzad, how so? Yud gefanim tunos masarti loch. Let's say the person says, 10 vines with grapes I gave to you, v'alo amreinon alachamish, and the person is essentially a mod of a mixas. He says, no, I only owe you 5. Rabbi Meir mechayev. Rabbi Meir says he's chayev to take a shvua. That's a shvuas mod of a mixas in this case. V'chachamim omer, and the chachamim say, kol ha'mechuber lekarka hareo kekarka. Since it's attached to the ground, it's considered like ground, and there is no shvua in such a case. V'yomer Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, and Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina says, anovim ha'omdos libotzer ika beinayu. The machlokas between them is specifically regarding grapes that are ready to be harvested. The mar savar kevitzuros damian, that Rabbi Meir holds it's like it's already harvested, it's not considered karka, that's why there's a shvua. Umar savar lav kevitzuros damian, and the chachamim say it's not like it's harvested, it's considered part of the ground, it's considered the ground, and there is no shvua. But in any case, what do you see? You see that Rabbi Meir is saying if it's considered like it's harvested, so it's not the ground, but actually actual karka, you would not take a shvua. So you see that Rabbi Meir holds by karka, you don't take a shvua. So again, saying our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir does not help. And the Gemara continues, Ela liolam kid Reb Hoshia, rather you have to go back to the answer we gave before, like Reb Hoshia, meaning to say, you have to say that it's a Gilgal shvua happening over here. Let's say there's a discussion about the sheaves. Once you're taking a shvua on the sheaves, you can have a shvua on the land as well. Similarly, by avodim, if you're having an argument about the clothing of the avodim, once you're taking a shvua on that, you can have a Gilgal shvua and take a shvua on the avodim as well. With the kashalach, but your difficulty with that answer was zokakin, that what you're teaching us a chiddush of Gilgal shvua. We know that from a Mishnah, but the answer is itzrich. No, it is necessary to teach it here. Because I might have thought that the garments of an eved are like the eved. It's not like a separate item. Omrei sadik kasadadami, the sheaves of the field are like the field, and therefore again it's not like a separate item. So maybe you wouldn't apply this idea of Gilgal shvui here at all, because it's really just like an argument over the eved, or it's just like an argument over the field. Kamash malon. That's the chiddush of the Mishnah, that's considered separated. We can separate those two out and say there's a shvua on the metaltalin, and then do Gilgal shvua on the karka or on the avodim. And Rashi explains, one might have thought ke'eved damya, that it's considered like an eved, v'chadam milsi, it's all one thing, v'lo tachai v'shvua, and there would be no shvua, and the chiddush is that there is a shvua. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, quoting the Brisa above, Zeh omer eini yodeya, v'zeh omer eini yodeya yachloku. If this one says I don't know, and this one says I don't know, we divide. That's talking about a situation where they're arguing over the offspring. And the Gemara says, Hamoni sumchasi, who's the author of the Brisa? It's sumchas, the amar maman hamotel b'safek cholk, and he says that if you have money and there's a doubt about it, you divide it. That's exactly what the Brisa is saying. But the Gemara says, but look at the end of the Brisa, Zeh omer b'rashusi, v'zeh omer b'rashusi. This one said it happened in my rishus, this one said it happened in my rishus, meaning in a case where they're both certain, Yishava hamocher shebershuso yalda, so then the seller should swear that it was in his rishus that the offspring was born, and then the mocher will keep the offspring. And so the Gemara asks, so the Rabba bar Rav Huna, according to Rabba bar Rav Huna, de Omar in Omar sumches afilu bari ubari, who says yes, sumches says divide even in a case where both sides are certain. So in this case, both sides are certain. Amai yishava mocher. Why is the seller swearing? Yachloku by it should say yachloku. There's a similar question that we asked on the previous summit, and the Gemara gives a similar answer. Mode sumches hecha deika shvua doraisa. Sumches would admit in a situation where there is a shvua on a doraisa level, meaning essentially this is a case of mode of a mixas, and therefore there's a shvua. That's why we don't say divide, rather we say the mocher takes the shvua. With the kata liyada, we have to say that the cases where the hand is severed, kid Rava, like Rava said. Rashi explains Zeh omer eini odeya. Again, the first part of the brisa, this one says I don't know, the other one also says I don't know. A brisa kamahad, we're going on the brisa now. The hamachlif para b'chamor, this is the brisa which talks about exchanging the cow for the donkey. And so then you have to say the kata liyada de shivcha. What happened is that the shivcha's hand was severed. The lav helachu, it's not a case of helach, because he's not actually going to present the shivcha or admit to the shivcha, so to speak. Rather, he has to give the value because her hand was severed. Umi min hatainu, and also what's happening here is there's a partial admission from the claim. The shivcha uval de chad gufa hu toinle, because the person is claiming from him both the shivcha and the vlad, and the seller is saying you're entitled to the shivcha, but you're not entitled to the vlad, you're not entitled to the offspring. V'zeh de v'mixas, that's considered mod of a mixas. Rabbi Meir islay nishboin alo avodim, and we'll be following Rabbi Meir, who says that you make a shvua on avodim, and so again, sumchis would admit, since there's a shvua and a shvua doraisa in this case, that shvua is taken. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, hamocher zeisav le'etzim, if somebody sells his olive trees for the wood, meaning the buyer is supposed to chop down those trees and use the wood, but then he doesn't chop it down right away, v'yasu pachos meravias l'sa, and let's say those olive trees now produce olives, but the olives are low quality, they produce less than a quarter of a revius per saw of olives, so harei elu shel bal hazeisim, so then the person who bought the olive trees, the buyer, he can get those olives. But what if they made higher quality olives? Asu revius l'sa. Let's say they made high quality olives that can produce a quarter of a lug of oil per saw of olives. So now they argue, Zeh omer zeisi gadlu. One says it's my olive trees that cause these olives to grow, meaning the buyer's the one that wants the olive. V'zeh omer artzi gadla. And the seller says, no, it's my land, it's sitting on my land, it should be my olives. So in that case, the Mishnah says, yachloku, they should divide the olives. Rashi here explains, hamocher zeisav le'etzim sheyokotz osan l'sreifa. The idea is the buyer is supposed to chop them down to burn the wood, v'sho osan bekarka, but instead he leaves them on the land, v'yasu zeisim roim, and it produces low quality olives, shein b'soshav en revias shemen, that one saw of these olives don't even produce a quarter of a lug of oil. So again, in that situation, the buyer can keep the olives, but where they're higher quality, so there they divide it. And the Mishnah continues, Shataf Nohar Zesav. Let's say a river, it floods through a person's property, and it sweeps away his olive trees, and it places them in the field of his friend. Now the olive trees have moved from one field to the other, and now they take root in this other field, and it grows. Zeomer Zeisi Gadlo. This one says it's my olive trees that grew. Zeomer Artzi Gadlo. The other one says no, it was my land that caused it to grow. It essentially took root and got nutrients from my land. So Yachloku. So in that case, they divided. And the Gemara says, Heichi Dami, what exactly is the case? Ido Amar Le Kotz La'alter. If the seller said to the buyer, cut it down right away, so then Afilu Pachos Meravias Nami LeBal HaKarka. The Bal HaKarka, the owner of the land, he wanted him to take the trees right away, and he didn't. So even if it's low quality olives, the owner of the land should get the olives. And Ido Amar Le, and if the owner of the land said to the buyer, Kolemas the boys coats, whenever you want to, you can cut it down. So then he wasn't makbid. So Afilu Ravias Nami LeBal Zesim. Even if it was good quality olives, the owner of the olive trees should get them. And the Gemara says, Lo no tzricha, it's necessary. The Amar Le Stoma, he just told him to cut it. He didn't give him a timeline. So then it depends on the olives. Pachas me revius, if it's low quality olives, low kapti inchi, people are not strict about that. It goes to the buyer. Revius kapti inchi, but if it's higher quality olives that produce a quarter lug of oil, so then people are strict about that, and that remains with the owner of the land. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Shimon ben Pazi. Rav Shimon ben Pazi says, Revius sha'amru, when we talk about the revius, and we'll note that the Mesoras Hashas says it should be Rav Shimon ben Lakish, referring to Reish Lakish, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kof Aleph Amud Aleph.